everybody. I want to report to you today on something I think is terribly important to our system of government. The honesty of our public officials. Now, when we pay taxes, and rather high taxes, we don't like to have that tax money wasted or stolen. And even more important, we happen to be in a deadly serious, almost death battle or Cold War to show that our system of government is better than that of another powerful country which is trying to show us up to the world as corrupt and decadent capitalism. So we've got to keep our system clean. Now, some of you may remember that I got into a lot of trouble and was called some very violent names because I pointed to influence peddling and wire pulling and dishonesty in Democratic administrations. Some of the things I exposed helped us convict Joe Noonan and Dan Bolick, the tax collectors who collected your taxes but didn't collect their own. Also, Frankie Costello went to jail, and John Marigon, the influence peddling friend of President Truman, and the owners of the Tan Foran racetrack, 4 congressmen, and several others all went to jail. And when I exposed how General Harry Vaughan, the military aide to President Truman, pulled wires for Marigon and the Tan Foran racetrack, President Truman let loose at me with some names that everybody remembers. Now, it isn't pleasant to be called names by the President of the United States. But as long as I am in Washington, I intend to expose graft and corruption, no matter what the administration in power, whether Democratic or Republican. And I'll be back in a minute to give you the inside story of what is happening today. Now, everyone had hoped that when President Eisenhower was elected on the issue of getting corruption out of government, that his administration would relentlessly carry out such a policy. And as one of those who first proposed Ike for president and who personally urged him to run, I know that I had great hopes for a clean-as-a-houndstooth policy. I was a little concerned, therefore, when I first learned that a representative of the first Boston company, a big investment corporation, was planted inside the Budget Bureau to swing a big electric power contract in the Tennessee Valley to Dixon Yates. And for 6 months, I tried to get full information on this banker's agent. And for 6 months, top officials simply refused to give that information. I asked Senator Hill of Alabama to try to get the information, but he also was rebuffed. I asked Senator Langer of North Dakota, a Republican, to subpoena the information, but he again ran up against the Eisenhower administration, which refused to give it. Even a U.S. senator was not able to get it. President Eisenhower even officially denied at a press conference that bankers had anyone inside the Budget Bureau working on the Dixon Yates contract. But finally, it leaked out that Adolph Wenzel of First Boston was inside the Budget Bureau and was working with atomic energy officials to promote Dixon Yates. The Justice Department has now finally made a matter of court record this conflict of interest, which previously was denied so emphatically and so repeatedly. Now let's look at the rest of the record. There was another conflict of interest case, that of Secretary of the Air Force Harold Talbot, which went right up into the cabinet. You all remember it. Talbot was very wealthy, one of the biggest money raisers for Eisenhower, yet he was serving his own pocketbook interest while supposedly working for his country. Then there was Peter Strobel, in charge of government buildings, whom I exposed for using his official position to get money out of the Army for his own engineering company. Then there was Edward Foote of the Justice Department, who invested $68,000 through his wife in Gulf Oil and Warren Petroleum, one day after he was asked to okay or block their merger. He okayed the merger and then invested in it secretly. Then there was the case of a state administrator for the Farmers Home Administration, which is supposed to protect and help small farmers, Carl O. Hansen of Montana. I reported that instead of helping farmers, he was working on the side buying wool for the Draper Company of Boston. However, I want to give Secretary Benson credit for firing him immediately after I reported this. Now, it's a fine idea to have businessmen in government, but a businessman has to be just as clean and honest as a career civil servant. He can't work for 2 masters. When he serves his country, he has to serve his country. He can't serve his own pocketbook. Of course, the President of the United States can't always keep his eye on all the rotten apples that may slip into the government barrel, but he does have to act vigorously and punish the guilty when those rotten apples are called to his attention. That, I regret, has not always been the case. Attorney General Brownell did act vigorously when a Senate committee revealed that E.H. Thornton, the port manager of Galveston, Texas, was mixing Canadian hog feed with government wheat and selling it as wheat for human consumption, all a matter of sworn evidence before the committee. So Mr. Brownell quite properly indicted Thornton and the officials of the Bunge Corporation, which owned the wheat, an Argentine firm. But what Brownell didn't know was that Thornton was the father of Governor Shivers' campaign manager down in Texas. So just a week before Thornton's trial, Governor Shivers flew up to Washington, had lunch with Eisenhower alone, and 3 days later, the criminal case against E.H. Thornton was suddenly dropped on direct orders from Washington. Now, as I said a minute ago, the president can't always know about corruption, but he can root it out and punish the offenders. Now, one scandal he didn't have to get mixed up in was out in Illinois, but when he spoke in Peoria, he went out of his way to praise Governor Stratton of Illinois. He said, "I like a man who, when anything goes wrong in government, cleans up fast. That is the way Governor Stratton works." Well, Ike was referring to the fact that Orville Hodge, the Illinois state treasurer, had just gone to jail for stealing $1.5 million. However, it was not Governor Stratton who sent Hodge to jail, but the U.S. attorney. Governor Stratton could have cleaned up fast, but he didn't. He had a state treasurer, Warren Wright, who was supposed to audit the books every 3 months, but Wright may have had a scandal of his own. He's been presented with a new trailer, a new Buick, a new Jeep, and $25,000 cash expense money by the bankers, the same bankers who want to get state funds deposited in their banks. Obviously, Wright wasn't watching State Auditor Hodge very carefully. Also, Governor Stratton, who's supposed to clean up fast, had 4 state school officials indicted on a charge of conspiring to cheat on school lunches. Vernon Nickel, state superintendent of schools, has been indicted along with James Dunbar, prominent Republican, who has a contract to haul food to the schools and who's charged with cheating on that food to the tune of $114,000. Now, it was in April 1955 that Congressman Fountain of North Carolina exposed the fact that things were wrong in the Illinois school lunch program. Thus, Governor Stratton had 18 months in which to clean up. Obviously, he did not clean up fast. I sometimes think that President Eisenhower just doesn't seem to realize that he at the top and everyone else in government, both state and federal, have to be extremely alert and have to set a fine example in order to prevent corruption. And that he must not give his blessing to a governor who obviously and definitely has not cleaned up. I'll be back in a minute with some other scandals. I regret to report there's been a lot of government corruption in the past few years, but it isn't fair to blame it all on Washington. Up in Pennsylvania and New Jersey, a Republican-appointed Delaware toll bridge authority was so free with the taxpayers' money that they paid $700 to Nani Brandt, a burlesque dancer. Nani was billed as Miss TNT of Gay Paris, but she was paid for stenographic work. Members of the Bridge Authority have now been indicted for taking fancy trips all over the country from Las Vegas to San Francisco and for paying themselves $78,000 in illegal salaries. Also in Pennsylvania, there's another scandal involving the Republican chairman of the Turnpike Commission, Thomas J. Evans, who had a neat family arrangement with the Manu Mine Corporation, of which his son, Richard Evans, was secretary-treasurer, and awarded the company some $9 million worth of contracts to fill in abandoned coal mines, which the company didn't do. Well, these are state scandals, and as I said, it isn't fair to connect them with the Eisenhower administration. But they are shocking indications of how low government morality has dropped, not merely in Washington, but all over the nation. One ironic twist of this low morality was given in Kansas, the home state of Eisenhower, where Ike's Republican friends have just nominated Warren Shaw to be governor, despite the fact that Shaw, as Republican chairman of Shawnee County, collected 1 cent on every gallon of gasoline used by the state in that area. I have here the sworn affidavit of Walter Van Vleck of City Service, admitting that after he got a contract with the state of Kansas, he had to go down to see Warren Shaw to make regular contributions to the Republican campaign fund. In other words, the people of Kansas paid extra for the state's gasoline in order to finance the Republican Party, not the state. And the man who engineered that deal and collected the money is now the nominee for governor. Not exactly clean as a hound's tooth. Now, I report this as one who punched pretty hard at the Truman administration, punched hard at any administration where there's any taint of graft. I don't know that political change is the answer. I do know that you can't cure juvenile delinquency when there's adult delinquency at the top. I also report this as one who's convinced that we must have honest government servants in every administration if we are to keep our system of free enterprise and make democracy live.